She had one night to live, one name to destroy, and one choice that would change everything. The year was 1882. The Colorado mountains were swallowing her whole, and the men hunting her weren't just corrupt. They were killers. The same kind of killers who put her father in the frozen ground and smiled while doing it. Evelyn Mercer had the proof. She had the ledger. And she had maybe 3 miles before her lungs gave out in the cold. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit like, stay until the end. This one's worth it. The storm came without warning. That was the cruelest part of it. Not the cold itself, not the way the wind scraped raw against every exposed inch of skin, but the sheer indifference of it all. 1 hour the sky had been pale and overcast, bruised gray along the western ridgeline. The next, the world disappeared. White swallowed everything. Trees became shadows. The trail Evelyn had been following, a narrow cut through lodgepole pines that she'd memorized from her father's old survey maps, simply ceased to exist beneath 2 feet of fresh powder that fell so fast it seemed less like snow and more like the mountains themselves exhaling. Evelyn Mercer had been riding for 11 hours. She didn't know that with any precision. Her father's pocket watch, the one she'd taken from his coat pocket 2 nights ago, still warm from his body heat, the hands frozen forever at 11:47, had stopped working sometime around midday when the cold worked its way into the brass casing and seized the mechanism. She knew time only by the color of the sky, and the sky had gone dark an hour ago, maybe more. Her fingers had stopped cooperating with her thoughts around the same time, which made it difficult to be certain about anything. The horse beneath her, a broad-chested bay mare named August that had belonged to her father, was slowing. Evelyn could feel it in the way the animal's gait had changed, that rolling, powerful stride replaced by something labored and irregular. August's breath came in visible clouds, heavy and rhythmic, and her flanks were dark with sweat that would freeze against her coat if they didn't find shelter. "Come on, girl," Evelyn whispered. Her voice came out cracked and thin, barely audible over the wind. Just a little further. She didn't know where further was. That was the honest truth she'd been refusing to say aloud for the last 2 hours. She was lost. The blizzard had taken her landmarks one by one. First the granite outcropping she'd been using to orient herself, then the creek she'd planned to follow north, then the silhouette of the lower ridgeline that would have told her how far she'd climbed. Now there was just white and wind and the terrible, seductive urge to stop moving. She didn't stop. She thought about her father instead. Thomas Mercer had been a bookkeeper his entire adult life. 43 years old, slight-framed, with ink-stained fingers and reading glasses he was always misplacing. He wasn't a man who inspired fear or demanded attention when he walked into a room. He was the kind of man who sat in the back and kept careful records and noticed things that other people overlooked because they were too busy being loud. That habit had killed him. For 3 years he'd worked as the account manager for Granger Land and Cattle, the company that had been quietly, systematically consuming the eastern Colorado frontier like a fire consuming dry grass. On the surface, Silas Granger was everything the territory admired: wealthy, well-connected, polished in the way that made politicians lean in when he spoke and look away when they shouldn't have. He threw parties for territorial judges. He donated to church-building funds. He had a photograph of himself shaking hands with a U.S. senator hanging in the lobby of his Denver office. What he also had was a ledger, not the official one, not the leather-bound record book that sat on the shelf in the main office where any auditor or county clerk could flip through it and find everything perfectly ordered and perfectly fraudulent. The real one. A smaller book, cloth-covered, its pages dense with columns of numbers that told a very different story. Forged land surveys, falsified debt records, bribed county officials, purchased witnesses, and in the margins, in Granger's own handwriting, dates and names and payments that connected, if you knew how to follow the trail, to 6 men in the Colorado Territory who had died under circumstances that were called accidents or robberies, or in one case, a riding accident on a clear day with no witnesses. Thomas Mercer had found it 3 weeks ago in a space behind a loose board in Granger's private office, where he'd been sent to retrieve some files. He'd had enough sense not to take it immediately. He'd had enough sense to copy out the most damning pages by hand, carefully and quietly, over the course of 2 weeks while his hands shook so badly, some nights he could barely hold the pen. He hadn't had enough sense to trust no one. Evelyn still didn't know who he'd told. She probably never would. She only knew what she'd found when she came home 2 nights ago to their small house on the edge of Cartwell. The door hanging open in the cold, the lamp knocked off the table, and her father on the floor of the sitting room with his hands folded across his chest in a way that looked deliberate, almost staged, because it was. Someone had wanted her to understand the message. She'd stood in the doorway for a long time, long enough for the cold to come in and for the lamp oil to burn down low. Then she'd walked inside, knelt beside her father, and stayed there until she was certain he was gone. She closed his eyes. She took his watch, and then she stood up, went to the loose floorboard in the back bedroom where he kept important documents. She'd known about it since she was 12, and found what he'd left for her, the copied pages, and a note, 3 sentences in his careful accountant's hand. They know. Take this north to Marshall Harding in Boulder. Don't trust anyone in Cartwell or Denver. Granger owns all of them. She'd been riding north ever since. August stumbled. It wasn't dramatic. No rearing up, no violent fall. Just a sudden sideways lurch as the mare's left front hoof broke through a crust of ice and plunged into empty air where the trail had crumbled away at the edge of a shallow ravine. Evelyn grabbed at the saddle horn with both hands, but her fingers were too numb to grip properly, and when August wrenched sideways trying to recover her footing, Evelyn went over. The fall lasted maybe a second. She hit a slope of packed snow and slid 8 or 10 feet before a buried boulder caught her side and stopped her. The impact knocked the air out of her lungs completely, and she lay there in the snow, staring up at the dark sky with absolutely nothing in her chest, that terrible airless panic that felt like dying, until finally her diaphragm remembered what it was supposed to do, and she hauled in a ragged, desperate breath. August had recovered. The mare stood at the edge of the ravine, breathing hard, favoring her left leg. In the dim light, Evelyn could see the way the animal was holding it, not touching the ground, shifted back. "No," Evelyn said out loud. Her voice was strange and thick with cold. "No, no, no." She got herself upright, which took longer than it should have, her body stiff and only partially cooperative. She climbed back up the slope and went to the mare, running her hands down the injured leg as carefully as she could. August shifted away from the pressure and made a low, unhappy sound. Bowed tendon, maybe worse. In the summer, in good conditions, it might be manageable. In the middle of a blizzard at altitude, in the dark, it was a death sentence. For August if she pushed the animal further, and for Evelyn if she didn't find shelter within the next few hours. She stood there for a moment, her hand on August's neck, and allowed herself exactly that long to feel the full weight of how bad things were. Then she unbuckled the saddlebags, slung them over her own shoulder, and started walking. "I'm sorry, girl," she said. "I'm sorry." She didn't look back. Okay. The cold was a different thing on foot. On horseback, August's body heat had done something. Not much, but enough. Now there was nothing between Evelyn and the wind except her wool coat and the flannel shirt beneath it and a pair of men's gloves she'd grabbed from her father's coat hook on the way out because her own had been too light. The gloves were too large. The cold came in at the gaps around her wrists. She kept moving because stopping would kill her. She knew that with a certainty that was almost calming. It transformed the decision into something simple: move or die. And she was not ready to die. She had her father's ledger pages, folded small and wrapped in oilcloth, tucked inside her boot against her shin where they'd stay dry. She had a name: Marshall Harding, Boulder. She had a debt she intended to collect. So she walked. The terrain was rough under the snow. Rocks and roots, and the occasional shallow gulch that appeared without warning. She fell twice more in the first half hour, the second time badly enough that she lay there for a moment wondering if something had broken. Her left knee ached in a deep grating way that she catalogued and put aside. Not broken, just damaged. She could work with damaged. The wind picked up. She'd been cold before, but not like this. This wasn't discomfort. This was the cold getting inside her thoughts, softening her edges, making things that were clearly stupid seem almost reasonable. Wouldn't it be fine to rest for just a few minutes? There was a depression in the snow against that fallen tree. Sheltered, out of the wind. She could sit, just for a little while. She caught herself walking toward it and stopped. "Keep moving," she said out loud. Hearing her own voice helped. It was strange and too loud in the muffled world of the blizzard, but it was hers, and hearing it reminded her that she was still here. Thomas Mercer's daughter doesn't sit down in the snow and wait to die. Keep moving. Thomas Mercer's daughter kept moving. What? She didn't see the cabin at first. She saw the light, a single orange point, dim and distant through the driving snow, appearing and disappearing as the gusts shifted. She stopped, thinking at first that it was a trick of her oxygen-deprived brain, some hallucination generated by cold and desperation. But it didn't move. It stayed in one spot, steady and faint, and when the wind dropped for just a moment, she could make out the dark rectangular shape of walls against the white slope of the mountain. She changed direction. The walk to it took what felt like a very long time. The snow was deeper on this section of the slope, knee-high in some spots, and her legs were shaking badly enough that she had to concentrate on each step. But the light didn't disappear. She fixed her eyes on it and walked toward it with the single-minded focus of someone who has run out of alternatives. The cabin was small and solidly built, log walls chinked with something that had darkened with age, a stone chimney from which smoke was rising and immediately shredding in the wind. A lean-to on the right side sheltered what looked like a woodpile. No lights in the windows. The glow was coming from inside, through the shuttered gaps. She made it to the door. For a moment she just stood there, her hand raised, unable to make herself knock. Because knocking meant someone would open the door, and someone opening the door meant that her father's warning would come into play. Don't trust anyone. And she'd been running from people all day, and here she was about to ask one for help. But the alternative was the snow. She knocked. Mitad. Nothing happened for long enough that she was starting to calculate whether she could force the door. Her hands weren't working well enough, probably not, but there was the lean-to she could get out of the wind, and then there was a sound from inside. Heavy footsteps, a pause that felt deliberate, like someone considering. The door opened. The man in the doorway was the largest person Evelyn had ever been this close to. Not just tall, and he was very tall, a good 6'3" at least, which put him nearly a foot above her, but built in a way that suggested the mountains themselves had had something to do with it, broad through the chest and shoulders, with forearms visible below rolled-up sleeves that were corded with visible muscle. He was maybe mid-30s, difficult to be certain, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in at least a week. He was also holding a rifle, not aimed at her, held loosely at his side but held, in the casual way of someone for whom a firearm was less a weapon and more an extension of habit. His eyes, dark, very dark, hard to read in the firelight, moved over her with a thoroughness that was uncomfortable, taking inventory. Then they dropped to her hands. "What are you carrying?" he said. His voice was low and even, completely without warmth. "Saddlebags," Evelyn said. Her teeth were chattering. She was aware of how she must look. Coatless snow, ice crystals in her hair, hands that were probably turning the wrong color. "Just supplies. Some papers." "Papers." "Yes." A pause. He looked past her into the dark, scanning the slope she'd come down. Looking for someone with her, she realized. Looking for a trap. "There's nobody else," she said. "My horse went lame. I've been walking for—" she didn't know how long. "A while. I'm not going to make it back down the mountain in this storm." He looked at her for another moment, then he stepped back from the doorway. "Get inside," he said, "before you let all the heat out." The interior of the cabin was small but not cramped, the ceiling just high enough that the man, she didn't know his name yet, didn't quite have to duck. One main room that served as kitchen, living, and workspace, a stone fireplace taking up most of the back wall with a respectable fire going, rough-hewn table and 2 chairs, a narrow cot along the side wall with a wool blanket folded at the foot, tools hanging from pegs, a rifle rack with 2 additional weapons. On the table, an oil lamp and what looked like a partially cleaned hunting knife and a small whetstone. It smelled like wood smoke and pine resin and something cooking, some kind of stew, she thought, from the iron pot hanging over the fire. Evelyn stopped just inside the door and stood there dripping snow onto the plank floor, and for a moment her knees genuinely considered giving out. She locked them through sheer will. The man set his rifle against the wall by the door, not out of arm's reach, she noted, just not actively in his hands, and turned to look at her properly. Now she could see the scar. It ran from just below his left ear down to his jawline, a pale seam against skin that was otherwise tanned from outdoor work. Old scar, healed clean but deep, something that had happened a long time ago and been survived. She thought about her father's note, "Don't trust anyone." But her father had also raised her to be practical. Trust and use aren't the same thing. "You're hypothermic," the man said. Not a question. "I'm cold," Evelyn said. "That's what I said." He moved to the fire and used a hook to swing the iron pot to the side, then turned back. "Get your coat off. It's wet, and it's keeping the cold against you." "I'm fine." He looked at her hands. "Your fingers are white on the tips. You're not fine. Coat off. Sit by the fire. That order." He paused. "You can argue about it, or you can warm up. Your choice." She took her coat off. Her hands were shaking badly enough that the buttons were a problem. She worked through it without asking for help, getting the coat off and draping it over the back of a chair near the fire. Then she sat down in the chair closest to the hearth because her knees were finally reaching their limit, and sitting seemed like the better option. The heat hit her like a wave. For a moment it hurt, that deep aching burn that comes when cold tissue starts to understand what warmth is again. She pressed her lips together and didn't make a sound, but it took real concentration. The man brought her a tin mug. She wrapped both hands around it. It was hot, not warm, and the sensation in her fingertips went from burning to painful, and looked down at the contents, coffee, black, or something that approximated it. "Drink it," he said. She drank it. It was terrible, and it was the best thing she'd ever tasted. He stood a few feet away with his arms crossed, watching her with that same flat, assessing look. She got the sense that he was trying to decide something, whether to ask questions, whether she was dangerous, whether letting her in had been a mistake. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet." He moved to the window and looked out through the shutter gaps into the dark. "You said your horse went lame." "Left front. She went through ice at the edge of a drop-off." "Where?" "I don't—" She hesitated because admitting how thoroughly lost she was felt dangerous. Then she thought about the white fingers and the 2-hour walk and decided pride could wait. "I don't know exactly. Maybe 2 miles south of here? Down the slope, there's a ravine with crumbled edge." He nodded, like he knew the spot. "I'll see about your horse in the morning if the storm passes." "You don't have to—" "I'm not offering because I have to." He said it without inflection, just a correction. "I'm offering because leaving a horse to freeze when it might be salvageable is a waste, and I don't like waste." He looked at her again. "What's your name?" She'd been thinking about this on the walk over, knowing she might need to knock on a door, knowing she might need a name. She'd decided against a lie, because lies had to be maintained, and she was too tired to maintain anything right now. "Evelyn," she said. Just the first name. "Evelyn Mercer." Something moved across his face. It was quick, a flicker of something she couldn't read, and then it was gone, replaced by that same closed expression. "Rowan Blackridge," he said. "This is my cabin, my land." He crossed his arms again. "3 rules while you're here. You follow them, we won't have problems." She hadn't been expecting rules. "All right. First, don't lie to me. I don't care what your secrets are. You can keep those. But if I ask you something directly, I want a straight answer." She thought about the saddlebags on the floor by the door, the oilcloth packet inside her boot, the name of the man she was running from. "All right." "Second, earn your place. I'm not running an inn. You're capable of working. You work. You're not here to be waited on." "That suits me fine." "Third," he paused, and when he continued, his voice was slightly different, lower, something harder underneath it. "Don't interfere with my business. What I do, where I go, what I keep here, that's mine. You stay out of it." There was something in the way he said it, not a threat exactly, more like a warning from someone who had learned through experience what happened when people didn't respect boundaries. Evelyn filed it away. She was very good at filing things away. "Understood," she said. He looked at her for another moment, then gave a single nod, apparently satisfied. "There's stew on. You should eat before you sleep." Sam. The stew was venison, Evelyn thought, or something close to it, with root vegetables that had probably come from a root cellar and an amount of salt that suggested the man's palate had calibrated to his own company. It wasn't bad. She ate all of it. Rowan ate at the other end of the table without conversation, which suited her. She was too tired to talk, and he seemed to have no interest in filling silence with noise. It was a quality she found herself oddly relieved by. The men she'd been around most of her life, the ranchers and hands and county officials who came through her father's office, they were almost all uncomfortable with quiet. They filled it with opinions and jokes and the particular kind of bluster that served as a substitute for saying anything true. This man didn't seem to feel the need. After she finished eating, he pointed her toward the cot. "You take the bed. I'll be fine." She started to object. "You're injured," he said, without looking up from cleaning the whetstone. "And you've been in the cold for hours. Don't argue about it." She didn't argue about it. She lay down on the cot with her boots still on. Old habit, something her father had taught her. You don't take your boots off unless you're truly safe, and you're not truly safe until you know where all the exits are, and pulled the wool blanket over herself. The fire was warm. Her knee throbbed. Her father's watch pressed against her hip through her coat, its hands still frozen at 11:47. She should have been too cold to sleep, too afraid, too wired with everything that had happened in the last 48 hours, all of it pressing in on her. Her father's body, the deputies she'd seen riding out of Cartwell before she'd made it even a mile north, the blizzard, the fall, the long walk through the dark. She was asleep in 4 minutes. Well, in the morning, the blizzard was still going. Evelyn came awake fast, the way she'd been waking since she'd found her father. No slow drift up from sleep, just suddenly conscious, heart already working, hand reaching instinctively toward the knife at her belt. She lay still for a moment, listening, wind against the walls, the fire, lower now, but still going. Outside, the sound of the storm, steady, sustained, not easing. She sat up. Rowan was at the table, not where she'd left him. He'd moved the lamp and was bent over what looked like a map, tracing something with one finger. He didn't look up when she moved, but his shoulders shifted slightly in the way of someone who had been aware of her every movement since before she woke. "Storm's not breaking today," he said. Evelyn stood, testing her knee. It held, though there was a pulling sensation on the inside that wasn't going to improve without rest she didn't have time for. "How long do these usually last up here?" "Depends. 2 days, sometimes 5. 5 days. She thought about Marshall Harding in Boulder, about the men who'd been riding out of Cartwell behind her, about whether Silas Granger's deputies could follow tracks in a blizzard. Probably not. The snow would have covered everything, but they knew she'd been heading north, and there were only so many routes through the mountains at this elevation. "I need to get to Boulder," she said, "as soon as the storm breaks." "You and everybody else." He stood, rolling the map. "Sit down. I'll make coffee." She sat down, watched him move around the cabin. He was efficient in a way that spoke of long practice. Every motion purposeful, nothing wasted, nothing fumbling. He'd clearly been living alone up here for a while, long enough that the habits had settled deep. "Have you been up here all winter?" she asked. "Most of it." He set a pot over the fire. "By choice?" He looked at her. The scar caught the firelight. "Is that one of your business?" "Sorry," she said, and meant it. "You said don't lie to you. You didn't say anything about questions." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, close to one, maybe the bones of one. "Fair enough." He turned back to the fire. "By choice, mostly." That's a complicated answer. It's a complicated question. They sat in a quiet that wasn't uncomfortable, which surprised her. Outside, the storm threw itself at the walls with a sound like distant artillery. The fire popped. The coffee began to smell like something worth drinking. "Your horse is alive," Rowan said. "I checked at first light. She made it into the trees on the far side of the ravine. There's a rock overhang down there, natural shelter. She's not comfortable, but she's alive." Evelyn let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. August had been her father's horse for 6 years. She mattered. "Thank you." "Don't thank me, I told you." But he handed her the coffee, and she noticed he'd poured it so the mug was 3/4 full, which meant she got more than he did, and she didn't think that was accidental. The first day they didn't talk much. Rowan spent the morning doing the kind of maintenance work that accumulated in remote living, mending a section of leather harness, checking the chinking in the wall on the north side where the wind was loudest, sharpening tools. He moved through these tasks with a focus that felt almost meditative, and he didn't invite conversation, so Evelyn didn't offer any. Instead, she took stock of what she had and what she needed. Her saddlebags contained a half loaf of bread she'd grabbed from the pantry on her way out of Cartwell, now 2 days old, a small amount of dried beef, her father's survey maps of the northern Colorado Territory, a spare shirt and wool stockings, a box of ammunition for the revolver she wore at her hip, and wrapped carefully in her father's old handkerchief, a small portrait photograph of Thomas Mercer at maybe 30 years old, standing very straight in his good suit, looking at the camera like he was trying to make a good impression. She sat with that photograph for a long moment, then she put it away. The oilcloth packet was still in her boot. She took it out when Rowan was in the lean-to bringing in firewood and checked the pages. Still dry, still intact, the ink unsmeared. She counted them. 14 pages in her father's tight, careful hand, covering 12 separate incidents, names, dates, dollar amounts, land parcels. Some of the names she recognized, county officials, a judge, 2 men who she knew worked for Granger directly. Some she didn't. At the bottom of the last page, circled twice, her father had written a single name, Silas Granger. She folded the pages back into the oilcloth and tucked them into her boot. In the afternoon, she asked Rowan what she could do. He looked at her with what she was starting to recognize as his default expression, that flat, calibrating look, trying to determine whether the offer was genuine or performative. She stared back steadily. "Can you cook?" he asked. "Adequately. Adequately is fine." He gestured toward the root cellar access in the corner of the floor. "There's turnips and dried beans down there. Bread flour if you can make it work. I'll eat whatever you put together." She made bread that afternoon. It wasn't her best work. The altitude did something to the rise, and she hadn't used the stone oven before, so the bottom crust came out harder than she'd intended. But Rowan ate 2 slices without comment, which she took as a reasonable endorsement. That evening, while the storm raged and the fire burned low and steady, he looked across the table at her and said, "You running from someone?" Evelyn didn't answer immediately. She thought about the first rule. "Don't lie to me." "Yes," she said. He nodded, like this confirmed something. "They likely to find you up here?" "Not in this storm. After—" She considered. "I don't know. I'm trying to make sure it doesn't get that far." Another nod. He picked up the book he'd been reading. She couldn't see the title from where she sat, and opened it back to his page. The matter was apparently closed. She sat there thinking about how strange it was that the most honest conversation she'd had in 3 days had been those 6 sentences. The second day, the storm was worse. The wind hit the north wall hard enough in the early hours that something in the chinking cracked, and cold air came in at an angle above the window until Rowan stuffed the gap with wadded cloth and mixed a fast patch from ash and wet clay that would need real attention when the weather broke. He did all of this without complaint and without asking for help, though when Evelyn stood and held the lamp so he could see what he was doing, he accepted it without comment. They were developing a grammar of cooperation, wordless and efficient. She noticed what needed doing and did it. He noticed what she'd done and accounted for it. No performance of gratitude in either direction, just 2 people sharing a small space and making it function. He was, she was finding, a difficult person to read. Not because he was dishonest. She'd dealt with enough dishonest people in the last 48 hours to have developed a quick eye for the tells, the slight delays and lateral glances and over-specific denials. Rowan wasn't any of those things. He said what he meant and omitted what he didn't want to say, and the gap between those 2 things was large and carefully maintained, and she respected it because she was doing exactly the same thing. What was difficult was the rest of it. The way he watched the door when the wind shifted, not fearfully but alertly, with a precision that was more than simple mountain-living caution. The way he'd checked outside twice in the afternoon, despite the visibility being essentially 0. The rifle that was always within arm's reach. The locked chest under the cot she was sleeping on. Not a large chest, maybe 18 inches wide, bound with iron and padlocked with something serious, that he'd moved to the other side of the room on the first morning without explanation. He was waiting for something, or someone. She didn't ask. That second night, she woke at some hour she couldn't determine to find the fire rebuilt, and Rowan at the window, standing with his back to her, looking out at the dark through a gap in the shutter. He was very still. His rifle was in his right hand. She lay still and watched him. After a long time, 5 minutes, maybe more, he turned and went back to the chair he'd apparently been sleeping in, settled into it, and was motionless within minutes. The kind of person who could sleep in a chair with a weapon in his hands without it meaning anything particular. She thought, what is he watching for? She thought, the same thing you're watching for. She turned over and went back to sleep. On the third morning, the storm broke. Not gradually, the way storms sometimes dissolved into diminishing gusts and clearing skies. This one stopped almost categorically, as if something had simply decided that was enough. When Evelyn woke, the wind was gone. The sound of it, that constant siege she'd stopped consciously hearing by the second day, was simply absent, and the silence it left behind was so complete it felt physical. Through the gaps in the shutters, pale gray light, snowlight, the particular quality of reflected brightness that comes after a heavy fall. Rowan was already up, already dressed for outside, his coat on, his breath a small cloud in the air that was still cold despite the fire. Going to check your horse, he said without preamble, and scout the trails south. I'll come with you. He looked at her knee, which she'd been favoring. She straightened unconsciously. The snow will be 3 feet deep on the slope, he said. You'll slow me down. Then I'll slow you down. She held his gaze. August is my horse. A pause. Then, without argument, he handed her a pair of snowshoes from the wall, too large for her feet but workable, and went out. She followed, jamming her feet into the bindings as best she could. Outside was a different world. The snow was blue-white and immaculate, the sky above it the pale gold of early morning barely starting to warm. The trees were weighted with impossible amounts of white, branches bent to angles that looked structurally improbable. The mountain above them rose clean and severe against the sky. It was very beautiful. She didn't say so because it seemed beside the point, so they found August in the shelter of the rock overhang Rowan had mentioned, still standing, alert when she heard them coming, which was the most encouraging sign. The left leg was still tender. The mare pulled it away when Evelyn ran her hand down the fetlock. But she'd eaten some of the brush in the shelter, and she'd had snow for water, and she was against what Evelyn privately considered long odds, mostly all right. She'll need another day or two before she can carry weight, Rowan said, standing a few feet back, watching the horse and Evelyn both with that same calibrating eye. She'll get it. Evelyn pressed her forehead briefly against August's neck. The mare exhaled warm breath against the cold air. She's earned it. They made their way back up to the cabin in a route Rowan chose. He knew where the drifts would be deepest, where the trail was solid underneath the snow. And when they came around the east side of the building, he stopped and crouched in the snow. Evelyn stopped beside him. He was looking at tracks, not animal tracks, horseshoe marks, mostly filled in from the last of the blowing snow, but still visible to someone who knew what to look for. 2 horses. They'd come up the slope from the south, passed within maybe 60 yards of the cabin, and kept going. How old? Evelyn asked, very carefully. During the storm. He studied them for another moment. Yesterday, late. So they were moving through the blizzard, looking for something. He stood, brushed snow from his knee, and looked at her with an expression that was absolutely neutral. Or someone. She looked back at him and said nothing. Neither of them spoke again on the walk back to the cabin. But when Rowan held the door for her, she noticed he scanned the tree line to the south before he came in. And she noticed that the lock on the chest under the cot, no, across the room now, the chest he'd moved, was a different kind than she'd seen before. Good quality. The kind that meant whatever was inside was worth protecting. She found the bounty paper on the 4th day. It wasn't deliberate. She was not, despite what the circumstances might have suggested, the kind of woman who went through other people's belongings. Her father had raised her better than that, and also she was practical enough to understand that violating Rowan's 3rd rule, don't interfere with my business, in the wrong way could make her situation substantially worse. What happened was simpler and more ordinary. The chest had been moved back to its position beside the cot when Rowan cleared space for some repair work on the table. She was making up the cot with the blanket. It was one of her morning habits, making the bed, something her mother had instilled so early it had become automatic. And the folded blanket caught the edge of the chest's latch when she shook it out. The latch was old and the mechanism was worn. The lid swung open. She stood there with the blanket half folded, looking down. The chest wasn't large inside, which made what it contained very easy to see. A folded piece of canvas, 2 sealed letters, some kind of mechanical device she didn't recognize. And on top of everything else, placed as if recently referred to and not yet put away, a sheaf of papers. She shouldn't have looked closer. She looked closer. The top sheet was a telegraph transcription. She could see only the top portion, the date, the routing header, the first few lines. But those lines contained a number that was large enough to pull her eyes back to it, even as she was already starting to turn away. A reward figure. And below it, a description that took up 2 lines and ended with a name. Evelyn Mercer, age 23, bookkeeper. Recently employed by Granger Land and Cattle, Cartwell, Colorado. Wanted for questioning. Her hands were very steady. She thought that was interesting later. She'd expected them to shake. She lifted the telegraph transcription. Behind it was a wanted poster. Her face, reproduced from a photograph she didn't remember being taken. At the county fair last summer, she thought. She'd been standing next to Mrs. Alderman and someone had asked if they minded. Her name. Her description. The reward. And clipped to the wanted poster in Rowan Blackridge's handwriting, a note with a date from 4 days ago. Will intercept at North Pass. Confirm. She put everything back exactly as she'd found it. She closed the lid. She heard the worn latch engage. She picked up her blanket and finished making the bed. Then she sat on the edge of it for a moment, her hands folded in her lap, and thought through the shape of what she knew. Rowan had her bounty papers. He'd written a note about intercepting her. The date was from before the storm, before she'd arrived. He'd been planning to find her before she found him. She thought about the tracks in the snow. She thought about how he'd watched the tree line. She thought about the rifle always within arm's reach. She'd been right that first night. She'd been right to be afraid. She just hadn't been afraid of the right thing. She stood up. She went to her saddlebags very quietly. She found what she was looking for, the knife she carried for practical use, a 6-inch blade with a bone handle, sharp because her father had taught her to keep her tools sharp. She slid it into her belt. She began, very slowly and very carefully, to think about the door and the window and the snow outside and how far she would get on a bad knee and 3 feet of unbroken powder before he caught her. Not far enough. Not nearly far enough. The door opened. Rowan came in with an armload of firewood, kicking the snow from his boots, and stopped when he saw her standing in the middle of the room with her coat on and her hand at her belt where the knife was. He looked at her. She looked at him. "You found it," he said. Not a question, not an accusation, just a fact, delivered in that same flat, even voice. He set the firewood down by the hearth, slowly, deliberately, making no sudden movements, and straightened to his full height. Evelyn didn't move her hand from the knife. "The telegraph," she said, "and the poster. You were looking for me before I found your cabin." "Yes." "You took the bounty." "Yes." Her jaw was tight. "Then what's stopping you from taking me in right now? I'm standing right here." He looked at her for a long moment. The scar caught the firelight, and something in his expression shifted. Not softened exactly. More like something was deciding whether to surface. "Because," he said, "the man who put that bounty on you is the same man who burned my family alive." His voice was completely controlled. "And I need you alive, with that ledger, to finish what I started." He paused. "I'm not here to collect the money, Evelyn. I'm here to make sure nobody collects it before we get to Boulder." The fire popped in the silence between them. She stared at him, and he looked back at her without flinching, without calculation, with just that stark, stripped-down thing that people's faces do when they've stopped bothering to hide something terrible they've been carrying for a very long time. She hadn't expected the truth. She almost wished he'd lied. Outside, somewhere down the southern slope, a rifle shot cracked across the still mountain air. Then another. Rowan was at the window before she had time to think, and the look on his face when he turned back to her told her everything she needed to know about what was coming. "Get away from the door," he said, and this time there was nothing flat about his voice at all. Right now. She moved. The snow was still settling from the storm when the shooting started. The mountains didn't care. They'd been here before men arrived with their grievances and their rifles, and they'd be here long after. But the small light burning in the cabin on the slope, that light was still on. And the two people inside it were not, as yet, finished. The rifle shot cracked again, closer this time. Or maybe the mountain just carried sound differently in the new silence after 3 days of wind. Either way, Rowan was already moving. He went to the rifle rack first, pulled down the heavier of the two remaining weapons, and crossed to the window in 4 strides. He didn't open the shutter all the way. Just a crack, 2 inches, enough to see the slope below the cabin where the snow ran long and open before hitting the tree line. 2 riders, maybe 300 yards out, moving up through the powder in a way that said they weren't hunting deer. They were wearing the long coats that county deputies favored, dark against all that white. And they were not in any particular hurry because they'd already looked at the terrain and knew their quarry had nowhere to go. "How many?" Evelyn asked from across the room. "2 I can see. Could be more in the trees." He pulled back from the window. His voice had gone very quiet, the way of someone who had learned that panic was just fear with bad timing. "They'll wait us out if we let them, try to negotiate us into the open. And if we don't come out, then eventually they stop being patient." He looked at her, at the knife at her belt, at the way she was standing, not cowering against the wall, feet apart, watching him the way someone watches a person they're not certain has told them the truth. "We need to talk." "I noticed that." Her voice was careful, controlled. "You mentioned your family, the fire." "I did." "Were you going to mention it before or after you handed me over?" The question landed like she'd intended it to. Clean and direct, with no room to dodge around. Rowan turned from the window and looked at her fully. Outside, the riders had stopped moving. Waiting, like he'd said. "I wasn't going to hand you over," he said. "I took the contract to find you before Granger's men did, not to collect the money. That's a convenient thing to say now that I've found the papers. It's the truth. You said don't lie to you." She took 2 steps toward him, and he noted, without moving, that her right hand was still close to the knife handle. "Same rule applies." A long pause. He set the rifle across the table, but didn't move away from it, and she didn't miss that either. "Silas Granger killed my wife," he said, "and my daughter, 7 years ago, a fire." He said it the way you say something you've had to say before, not to many people, but enough that the words have worn grooves in you. The official story was a lamp accident. The real story was that I'd been looking into some land claims that weren't adding up in a county where Granger was operating. I was a surveyor at the time. I'd found some things. He stopped. "I found a lot of things." Evelyn was very still. "I spent 4 years trying to prove it through legitimate channels," he continued. "Lawyers, territorial officials, a state senator who took my money and disappeared. I had evidence that wasn't enough, and witnesses who recanted, and a story that made people uncomfortable in ways that made them want me to stop telling it." He picked up the rifle again, not aiming it anywhere, just holding it. "So I stopped trying to prove it. I started building a different kind of case. The bounty papers," she said. "Your father's ledger. I knew it existed. I've known for 2 years. I have sources who told me Thomas Mercer was keeping records, real ones, the kind that don't disappear when someone bribes the right people. When Granger put out the contract on you after..." He paused. "After your father, I took the job before one of his actual men could get to it. Because you have the ledger, and I know a federal marshal in Boulder who isn't in Granger's pocket, which is something that gets harder to find every year." The fire popped between them. Outside, nothing moved yet on the slope, but that wouldn't last. "Marshal Harding," Evelyn said. Something shifted in his face. "Yes. How do you know that name?" "My father's note. He told me to find Harding." She watched him process this. "Which means my father knew about you, or knew about someone who knew Harding. Your father was smarter than anyone gave him credit for," Rowan said quietly. "And it got him killed." He moved to the window again, checked the slope. The riders had edged closer. "We need to deal with what's happening outside right now. This conversation isn't finished." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." He looked at her for a moment. This woman standing in his cabin with a knife at her belt, and someone else's secrets in her boot, and a quality of stillness that he'd been noticing since the first night. The kind of stillness that isn't peace, but but is the closest thing to it that certain kinds of grief allow. "Can you shoot?" he asked. "My father taught me to use a revolver," she said. "I'm not fast, I'm accurate." He nodded once. "Accurate is better." He went to the chest. She watched him go to the chest, open it without hesitation, take out a box of ammunition and a second revolver that was older than his but in good condition. He held it out to her. "Take this. More stopping power than what you're carrying." She took it, checked the cylinder the way someone does when they've been taught properly and not just handed a weapon and wished good luck. He noticed. "We're not fighting our way out of this today," he said. "Not two, against however many they brought. What we're going to do is make it too costly for them to come through that door. And then we wait for them to make a mistake." He moved a chair against the wall beside the window, not in front of it, angled so that someone outside couldn't draw a bead on him through the shutter gap, but he could still see most of the slope. People who work for money instead of belief always make mistakes when things get complicated enough. Evelyn pulled the second chair to the opposite wall with a sight line to the door and sat in it. "You sound like you've done this before." "I've done a lot of things before." He settled into his position, rifle across his knees. "Some of them I'm not proud of." She didn't ask him to elaborate. They both watched their respective angles, and the morning passed in a strange, taut stillness, punctuated only by the occasional sound of movement from the tree line below. It was the most honest silence she'd sat in since her father died. The riders didn't come. Not that morning, not that afternoon. The tension of waiting for something that didn't happen was its own kind of exhausting, the way your body stays coiled hour after hour until the muscles start to ache from the preparation for impact that never comes. By late afternoon, when the light started to go gold and cold, Evelyn's left hand was cramped from holding the revolver, and her bad knee was speaking to her in terms she couldn't ignore. She stood to stretch. "They're still out there," Rowan said from his position at the window. He hadn't moved in 4 hours except to check the other window twice. There was a quality to his endurance that she found both impressive and slightly unsettling. The endurance of someone who had spent a long time alone with difficult things and learned how to outlast them. "I know." She rolled her shoulder, worked the cramp out of her hand. "What are they waiting for? Dark, maybe. Or for someone to tell them what to do." He glanced at her. "Granger's men aren't the thinking kind. They're the following orders kind. Which means there's someone giving orders, and that person isn't here yet." That thought settled in her stomach like cold water. "Someone's coming." "Someone's coming," he agreed, "which changes our timeline considerably." She crossed to the window and looked through the gap he'd left. 2 horses still visible at the tree line, their breath making small clouds. 2 figures dismounted, moving around each other with the bored restlessness of men on a job they don't particularly want but feel certain about because they have the numbers. "We can't wait for them to get reinforced," she said. "No, but we can't run either. Not today, not with August still, She stopped, recalculated. "How far is it to the next settlement? Something with a telegraph office?" He thought about it. 14 miles. There's a mining camp at the base of the Eastern Pass. They've got a wire. If we could get a message to Harding before, they'd be watching the wire." He shook his head. "Granger has people at every telegraph office in the territory that he thinks is relevant. Anything we sent would be read before it arrived." She turned away from the window and sat back down, thought through the shape of the problem the way her father had taught her. Start at the edges, find where the structure is weakest, work inward. Thomas Mercer had been, above everything else, a methodical man. "Then we don't telegraph," she said. "We ride. But we ride smart, not fast." He looked at her. "What does smart look like to you?" "It looks like not going where they expect us to go." She pulled out her father's survey maps from the saddlebag. She'd put them on the table that morning without thinking about it, just organizing her things, and spread the relevant section open. "Show me the routes you know that aren't on this map." He came and stood beside her over the map, close enough that she was aware of his height, the warmth off him in the cold cabin, the way he studied the paper with the eyes of someone who had covered this terrain on foot in weather that made today look hospitable. He pointed. "There's a ridge route here. It's hard going and it adds a day, maybe more in current snow. But it comes out above the main pass, and anyone watching the main pass won't be watching there because they won't think anyone is willing to try it in March." "Are we willing to try it?" "A beat. If your horse is sound enough by morning, and if you can keep up." I'll keep up, she said. Not defensively, just a fact. He nodded, and she thought she caught the ghost of that almost smile again, the same one from the first morning. It changed his face considerably when it was there, made him look younger, or maybe just less like someone who had made a project of keeping the world at a distance. She folded the map back up. That evening was strange in the way that evenings become strange when danger has settled itself around a space and decided to wait. Rowan made food, more of the stew, a different proportion this time, with more of the dried beef and less root vegetable, because they'd been working through the root cellar supplies, and they ate at the table with the lamp turned low enough that the light wouldn't be visible through the shutter gaps to anyone watching from outside. Practical. Sensible. Also oddly intimate in the way that necessity creates intimacy between people who wouldn't otherwise have led each other this close. She told him about her father, not all of it, not the tableau she'd found when she came home, not the way she'd sat on the floor beside him until the lamp burned out, but the parts that explained who Thomas Mercer had been. The careful records, the small house with its good bookshelf and its loose floorboard where he kept the things that mattered, the reading glasses he was always misplacing, the way he taught her figures and surveying and how to keep accounts, not because he wanted her to be a bookkeeper, but because he believed a woman who understood numbers was a woman nobody could cheat. Rowan listened without interrupting. He was good at that, being present without requiring anything, without filling the space with his own responses before she was finished. It was a quality she'd previously only encountered in people who had spent time with grief, learning the hard way that their job was to be a listener and not a fixer. When she was done, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He sounds like he was worth knowing." "He was," she said. "He was also infuriatingly stubborn, and he never replaced the latch on the back door, even though I asked him about it for 2 years. She looked down at the table. I would give quite a lot to argue with him about that latch right now. Rowan said nothing, which was exactly the right thing. He told her about the surveying work, not about his family, not yet, not the fire, that had been said once in the context of necessity, and the scar tissue around it was thick enough that revisiting it required more trust than 4 days built. But the work itself, the years of walking territory and mapping what he found, the particular way the Colorado mountains rewarded people who paid close attention and punished everyone else without mercy or apology. "It's honest work," he said. Or it was. It stops being honest when the people using your maps are using them to steal land from people who've worked it for 20 years. Is that when you stopped? He looked at his hands. Big hands, work-scarred, a white streak across the right knuckle that might have been from a rope burn or a blade. I stopped when I realized that the maps I'd made were evidence in Granger's files, and I couldn't get them back and I couldn't let them be used. He picked up his coffee. So I disappeared. Came up here. Spent 2 years figuring out what I was actually going to do. And then you took the contract on me. And then I took the contract on you. He looked at her directly. I want you to understand something. I have no interest in your money or your reward or whatever Granger is paying to have you brought in. I have interest in one thing. Granger, she said. Granger, he confirmed. Everything else is secondary. She turned this over. It wasn't comfortable exactly. Being someone else's means to an end was not a position she'd have chosen. But there was something about the nakedness of it, the refusal to dress it up in more palatable terms, that she found easier to work with than sentiment would have been. Then we want the same thing, she said. Yes. And the ledger pages get us there. Combined with what I already have, the ledger pages make a case that Harding can actually prosecute instead of just losing in the territory courts. Granger's bought every judge within 200 miles. Federal is the only level where the money doesn't reach. She thought about the 14 pages in her boot. The names circled twice. How long have you been building your case? 2 years. 3, if you count the time I spent not knowing what I was building toward. Something crossed his face. Not quite pain, but the shadow of it. The way long-healed injuries sometimes ache when the weather changes. I got close once. Last spring. I had a witness, a clerk who'd worked for Granger and had documentation on 2 of the land seizures. He was going to testify. He stopped. What happened? He fell down the stairs of his hotel in Denver, Rowan said flatly. Broke his neck. The hotel owner saw nothing. 2 guests saw nothing. The coroner called it an accident. The fire was burning low again. She didn't get up to feed it. The cold coming in at the edges of the room felt, in that moment, appropriate. He has people everywhere, she said. Everywhere he thinks matters, Rowan said. Which is why the ridge route matters. He's not watching places he doesn't think we'd go. She sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "What happened after the fire? After you lost—" She stopped, not wanting to name what he'd lost out loud without his permission. He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. When he did, his voice had the same controlled flatness as when he'd talked about the clerk, that carefully maintained surface over something that hadn't finished burning underneath. "I tried the legal route first," he said. "Like I told you, 4 years of that. Then I came up here." He looked at the far wall. "The first winter I was barely functional. I won't dress that up into something it wasn't. I got through it because I had something to work toward, and because sitting still was worse." He paused. Anger is a better fuel than people give it credit for, cleaner than despair. Anyway, she understood that with a completeness that didn't need articulation. Outside, very faintly, she heard one of the horses in the tree line move, a stamp and shuffle, the sound of an animal getting impatient in the cold. The men watching the cabin were still there, waiting for dark, or for orders, or for something to shift the stalemate. "They'll try something tonight," she said. "Probably." He stood, went to bank the fire down to coals, enough to keep the chill from becoming dangerous, not enough to be visible or to backlight him against the window. "You should sleep if you can. We'll need to be moving before first light if August is sound." "What about you?" "I'll watch." She looked at him, the set of his shoulders, the way he carried the rifle like it had been part of him for years, the scar that caught the low red light of the banked fire and made him look for just a moment like something elemental, something that the mountains had decided to make instead of rock. He was also, she thought, probably the most tired person she'd ever seen who was still upright. "Wake me at midnight," she said. "I'll take the second watch." He started to shake his head. "Rowan." She said his name deliberately, the first time she'd used it directly, and he went still. "You said earn your place." "I'm earning it. Wake me at midnight." A long pause. Then, with something that might have been relief working behind his expression, he said, "Midnight." She lay down on the cot with her coat on and her boots on, and the unfamiliar revolver in her hand, and she did not sleep for a long time. She thought about the ridge route in her father's maps and the name circled twice at the bottom of the last page. She thought about a fire 7 years ago, and a man who had come out of it changed into something harder and more patient than whatever he'd been before. She thought about the 2 riders in the tree line and the person coming who would give them new orders. She thought about the fact that she and Rowan Blackridge had more in common than she had with any person she'd known before him, and what a strange and particular cruelty that was, to find common ground on a foundation of catastrophic loss. The fire settled lower. The cold crept in at the windowsills. She was still awake when the noise came from the south side of the cabin. Not a rifle shot this time, something subtler. A scrape against the log wall that was either an animal or a man trying to be an animal. She was on her feet before she'd consciously decided to stand. Rowan was already at the south wall, one hand flat against the logs as if he could feel through them, his rifle up and his head angled to listen. She came to stand beside him. They stood like that in the near dark, close enough that she could feel the tension in him like a physical thing, the particular quality of a man who has been waiting a long time for the moment when waiting is finally finished, and listened to the mountain and the cold and the slow, deliberate sound of men moving around the outside of the building, trying to figure out whether the people inside had made a mistake they could exploit. She gripped the revolver. Rowan glanced sideways at her in the dark. She looked back. Whatever passed between them in that look was less a thing that could be named and more a thing that 2 people recognize as the moment the ground shifts under their arrangement, when it stops being 2 strangers sharing space and becomes something with more weight to it, more responsibility, more cost if it goes wrong. He turned back to the wall. She kept her eyes on the door. The scraping stopped. Silence stretched out long and cold and full of the promise of morning, which was still hours away. Neither of them moved. The scraping didn't come back. That was almost worse. The silence that followed it, the particular quality of stillness that isn't peace, but is men outside deciding something. Rowan stayed at the south wall for another 20 minutes after the sound stopped, his hand flat against the logs, head down and eyes closed in the way of someone using senses other than sight. Evelyn stayed at her angle on the door. Neither of them spoke. Finally, he straightened and crossed to the window, checked the gap. Whatever he saw, or didn't see, made something in his shoulders settle by a degree. They pulled back, he said quietly. Why? Temperature dropped another 10 degrees in the last hour. They're not equipped for a night siege in this cold. They'll camp in the trees, keep a watch rotation, and wait for morning. He moved away from the window. Or for whoever's coming. She lowered the revolver but didn't put it away. How much time does that give us? 4 hours, maybe 5 if the cold slows them down more than I'm expecting. He looked at her. You should actually sleep this time, I mean it. You said midnight. I said midnight and now I'm saying sleep. There's a difference between earning your place and running yourself into the ground before we've even started moving. He pulled the chair back to its position, sat down with the rifle across his knees. I've done enough night watches to manage one more. You haven't. She wanted to argue. She looked at his face in the dim red light of the coals and recognized the particular expression of someone who was not asking for debate. Not out of arrogance, but out of the exhausted pragmatism of a man who understood exactly what the next 24 hours were going to require of both of them and was doing the math accordingly. She lay back down. She was asleep in 6 minutes, which was 5 minutes longer than the first night and still faster than she would have thought possible, given everything. Exhaustion had its own arithmetic. Rowan woke her at 4 in the morning. He didn't touch her, just said her name once from 3 feet away, which told her he'd already figured out that she came awake fast and ready, and that reaching for someone in that condition was a good way to end up with a knife at your throat. She sat up, hand already on the revolver, and he held up one palm in a gesture that meant easy. It's me. Time to move, he said. The cabin was cold. He'd let the fire die to nothing in the last hour, probably so the smoke from the chimney would give less information about their timeline to anyone watching. She could see her breath. She pulled her coat on and stood, and the knee spoke to her immediately in that grinding, insistent way that said it had stiffened badly during sleep and was going to need convincing. She didn't limp where he could see it. They moved through the pre-dawn dark in a silence so practiced it felt almost choreographed. She packed the saddlebags while he gathered his own gear, the tools and supplies of a man who had thought through what he'd need if this situation ever arrived and had prepared accordingly. He took the ammunition from the chest, and 2 items she couldn't see clearly in the dark, and a folded document that he put inside his coat without comment. The chest itself he left behind. Empty, padlock open, the bounty papers still inside. She noticed that. She'd noticed he hadn't touched them since the moment she'd found them, as if leaving them where they were was a statement of some kind. Maybe it was. Outside, the cold was a different category of cold than anything the past few days had offered. The deep, brittle cold of 4 in the morning in the Colorado mountains in March. The kind that made the snow squeak underfoot and turned your exhaled breath into ice crystals before they'd traveled 6 inches. The sky was clear for the first time since the storm. Stars everywhere, more of them than Evelyn had seen in years. The kind of sky that the city never showed you because the lamps drowned it out. Rowan moved in the direction of the ravine without hesitation, picking a path through the snow that avoided the open slope, where the watchers in the tree line would have a sight line. She followed him, matching her footfalls to his where she could, letting the packed-down channels his snowshoes made do the work her knee was objecting to. August heard them coming and made a low sound. Not alarm, recognition. The mare had spent 4 days in the rock shelter and was visibly impatient with the arrangement, shifting her weight and showing the whites of her eyes at the dark and cold. Rowan checked her leg with his hands, quick and practiced. She allowed it. She'll do, he said. Keep the pace reasonable on the descent and she'll be fine. I know my horse, Evelyn said, and took August's bridle. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't quite read in the dark. Something between amusement and appreciation, the look of someone recalibrating a judgment upward, and then turned to collect his own horse from where he'd tied it further back in the shelter. A big gray gelding with a sensible disposition, answering to a name she hadn't heard him use yet. They were moving within 10 minutes of coming out of the cabin. The ridge route that Rowan had pointed out on the map the night before was, in daylight, the kind of path that made you understand why people didn't use it. It climbed northeast along a spine of exposed granite, where the wind had swept the snow into hard ridges and dropped it in unpredictable drifts on the lee side, and the footing was treacherous in a way that required constant attention. August picked her way carefully, and Evelyn let her set the pace, which was slower than she wanted but faster than fear would have suggested. They'd been climbing for about an hour when Rowan, ahead of her, pulled up and went still. She stopped August immediately, no signal needed, and listened. Below and to the south, back in the direction of the cabin, voices. Faint, carried up on the cold air. And then, after a moment, the sound of a door being forced open. They'd found the cabin empty. She looked at Rowan. His face was angled back toward the sound, jaw tight, calculating. "How long before they find our tracks?" she asked, very quietly. "The wind's been moving since midnight. The trail will be mostly covered on the lower section." He turned back to the ridge. "But they'll find it. They'll know the direction." He urged the gray forward. "We need more distance." She didn't waste breath on agreement and kicked August into a trot that made her knees scream and kept it there. The sun came up an hour later, rising fast over the eastern peaks and flooding the snow with a light so sharp it had physical edges. Beautiful and tactically inconvenient, clear visibility in every direction meant they could see anyone behind them, but it also meant anyone behind them could see two riders moving along a high ridge that stood out against the sky like pen marks on white paper. She kept expecting gunfire. Every time a gust moved the snow in the tree line below them, every time a rock shifted under a hoof and the sound carried, she felt the cold, specific anticipation of impact. It didn't come. They moved north along the ridge, the terrain dropping away on both sides, the world enormous and white and silent except for the wind. After 2 hours, Rowan pulled up at a natural break in the granite, where two large boulders formed a shelter facing east. He dismounted, and she did the same, just carefully, because the dismount required the left knee to cooperate in ways it was reluctant to. He noticed. He said nothing, which she appreciated. "We rest here 20 minutes, he said. "Water the horses from the canteen, eat something." "We don't have 20 minutes. We have exactly 20 minutes, he said, with the firmness of someone who has learned the hard way where the line is between pushing through and collapsing. "A horse that founders on a ridge pass is a problem we can't solve. Eat something." He handed her hardtack from his saddlebag and a canteen that was still liquid because he'd kept it inside his coat against his body. She ate without tasting it and looked back down the ridge at the trail they'd come up. Nothing moving. Not yet. "Tell me about Harding," she said. "How do you know he's clean?" Rowan leaned against the boulder, arms crossed, canteen in one hand. He thought about the question in the careful way he thought about most things. Not performing consideration, actually doing it. "I don't know it the way you know a mathematical fact. I know it the way you know that a particular piece of ice will hold your weight, based on evidence over time, with the understanding that you might be wrong." He paused. "Harding arrested 2 of Granger's men 3 years ago on a charge that everyone in the territory expected to disappear. It didn't disappear. They went to a federal facility in Kansas, and they're still there. Granger spent considerable money trying to get that overturned. Harding's name is on the conviction papers. That could be politics, a disagreement between powerful men that looks like integrity." "It could be," he agreed. "But Harding's also turned down 3 appointments that would have been promotions, all of them to positions where Granger had more leverage. And 2 years ago, a man came to his office in Boulder with a box of documents about Granger's land operations, and Harding didn't arrest him, didn't report the meeting, and spent 6 months quietly building a case before the documents disappeared." He looked at her. "That man was me." She turned this over. "What happened to the case?" "The documents disappeared. I told you." Something shifted in his jaw. "Someone broke into the federal building in Boulder and took the files. 3 weeks later, one of the surveyors I'd worked with was found in the South Platte River." He looked out at the ridge. "Harding sent me a letter. No names, no details. Just 4 words. Don't stop. I'm watching." She was quiet for a moment. The wind moved over the boulders above them with a sound like breathing. "He's been waiting," she said. "We've both been waiting," Rowan said, "for something that can't be stolen out of a federal building, something that lives in someone's memory and someone's boot." His eyes went to her feet. 14 pages of your father's handwriting, in your father's hand, with your father's signature at the bottom of each one. A witness who can attest to their authenticity and chain of custody. That's what Granger can't buy away. She looked down at her boot, at the faint outline of the oilcloth packet against her shin. My father knew what he was doing, she said. When he copied those pages, he knew that if the originals disappeared, his copies in his own hand, with his notations, that's testimony. That's a bookkeeper swearing in federal court to what he personally witnessed. Rowan's voice had gone quieter. He was the witness, Evelyn. The fact that he can't be there in person doesn't make the testimony disappear. It just means someone else has to carry it. She pressed her lips together and looked at the horizon. She had carried worse things. After 20 minutes, exactly as promised, Rowan pushed off the boulder and swung back onto the gray with the ease of someone who had spent years on horseback in difficult terrain. She mounted August more carefully, and they moved back onto the ridge and kept climbing north. It was 2 hours later, on a long descending traverse toward the eastern tree line, that they heard the riders below them. 3 horses, moving fast up a trail that paralleled the ridge to the west, below them and a half-mile distant, but visible in the clear air, moving with the confidence of men who had found a track and were following it hard. One of them, the one in front, was riding a horse Evelyn didn't recognize. The other 2 she knew, the long coats of the men who'd been watching the cabin. And behind all 3, pulling up the slope at a pace that suggested authority rather than urgency, a 4th rider on a horse that cost more than most men in the territory made in a year. She didn't know the 4th man, but something about the way he sat the horse, the deliberate management of his pace, the quality of the equipment on both animal and rider, something about it made her cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. Rowan had stopped beside her. He was watching the 4 riders with his rifle out of its scabbard, held across his saddle. "Who is the one in back?" she asked. "His name is Kate," Rowan said, and something in his voice was different, harder, more specific, the way your voice gets when a thing stops being abstract and arrives in the physical world. "Del Kate. He runs Granger's enforcement operations west of Denver. He's the one who—" He stopped. She looked at him. His face was completely controlled, which was how she knew it was bad. "He's the one who gave the order," Rowan said. "About my family. He didn't light the fire himself, but he gave the order." She was very still. "You're certain?" "I've been certain for 2 years." He watched Kate's horse pick its way up the slope. "He's also very good at his work, which means he's not going to stop at 2 men in a siege. He's going to take this seriously." "How seriously?" "He'll know the ridge route by now. He has surveys, Sheichwas, probably mine, from when I worked for the territory. He knows where this path comes out." He looked at her. "He's not following us. He's getting ahead of us." The shape of it landed in her stomach like a stone. "The Eastern Pass." "The Eastern Pass," he confirmed. "If he gets men to the bottom before we get down—" He didn't finish the sentence. "How far to the pass?" 3 hours at a good pace. Maybe 2.5 if we push and the horses hold." She looked at August. The mare's ears were up, tracking the distant horses below them with intelligent concern. The left leg was moving well, better than yesterday. She was a good horse. She'd been a good horse her whole life, which was the kind of fact that felt important to note. "Then we push," she said. Rowan looked at her for a moment. That same calibrating look, but different now, with something additional in it that she didn't have a word for yet. Then he turned the gray and touched his heels to the horse's sides. They pushed. The next 2 hours were the hardest riding Evelyn had done in her life, and she had grown up on a ranch where hard riding was simply what you did on the days that required it. The ridge descent was rough and fast, the kind of footing that asked for complete trust between horse and rider, and August delivered it, the mare finding her feet on icy rock and hard-packed snow with a sureness that made Evelyn feel, for the first time in 5 days, something close to grateful. They came down off the ridge into the upper tree line at a run, branches whipping past, the shadows cold and sudden after the open brightness of the heights. Rowan was ahead of her, the gray hitting the snow at the base of the descent and wheeling east without breaking stride, and she was right behind him, her knee braced against the saddle, her hand steady on August's reins. The Eastern Pass was a narrow cut between 2 granite faces, maybe 60 feet wide at its broadest, with walls that rose 30 feet on either side and collected wind and funneled it through with a sound like a knife being sharpened. In summer, it was passable by a wagon with careful management. In March, it was barely wide enough for 2 horses abreast. The snow compressed to ice on the floor of the cut by the wind. the footing treacherous in a way that would slow any horse to a careful walk. They heard the gunshot when they were 200 yards out. Not aimed at them, aimed up, a signal shot, the kind that says, "Here, now, move." It came from the far end of the pass, east side, which meant Kate's men had, as Rowan had predicted, come around ahead of them while they were still on the ridge. Rowan pulled the gray up hard. Evelyn stopped August beside him and looked at the cut. She could see at the far end the shapes of horses. 3 of them, at least. Maybe more in the rocks above the eastern wall. "They're in the pass," she said. "Yes." "And the men from the ridge will be coming down behind us." "Yes." She did the calculation. It was not a calculation with a good answer. 2 rifles and 2 revolvers against however many Kate had positioned at the exit of the only pass off this section of the mountain. Behind them, 3 riders who had been pushing hard and were probably 20 minutes out, less if they'd heard the signal shot and understood what it meant. "Is there another way through?" she asked. "Not that a horse can travel." He was scanning the walls of the cut. "There's a footpath on the north face that comes out above the pass, but it's—" He stopped. "What?" "It's 50 feet of near vertical climbing on ice-covered rock." He looked at her. "Alone, unloaded, maybe. Not with saddlebags, not with—" He stopped again, not saying not with your knee, but she heard it anyway. She heard it, and she put it away. "If we had time to get above them," she said, thinking aloud, not asking for permission, "we'd have the high ground. They'd be shooting up at us instead of across. We don't have time. We have 20 minutes before the riders from the ridge arrive." She looked at the north face. 50 feet of rock, iced over, with a bad knee and a saddlebag full of evidence that couldn't afford to fall into a snowdrift. "I've climbed worse." "You haven't climbed that." "Neither have you." She met his eyes. "But you're going to, because there isn't another option, and you know it." He looked at her for a long moment. She could see him running through alternatives, the same way she had, arriving at the same place she had, not wanting to agree because agreeing meant accepting that the next 20 minutes were going to be genuinely dangerous in a way that the last 5 days, for all their difficulty, had only been threatening. "The horses have to stay down here," he said finally. "We can't take them up." "August will wait." She was already dismounting, already pulling the saddlebag with the papers off the saddle. "She knows the command." She tied August's rein to a low branch, not so that the horse couldn't free herself in an emergency, just so she'd stand, and patted the mare's neck once, briefly, with no ceremony. Then she turned to the rock face and started looking for handholds. Rowan was beside her in a moment, the document from his coat transferred to an inside pocket, his rifle slung across his back. He found the first holds without apparent difficulty. The rock was rough granite beneath the ice, which meant once you broke through the surface, there was grip. "Keep your weight on your arms as much as possible," he said quietly, looking up. "Don't trust any handhold until you've tested it, and don't look down." "I wasn't planning to," she said, and started climbing. The cold made it hard in ways she hadn't anticipated. Not the temperature itself, but what it did to sensation. Her fingers found holds, but she couldn't fully trust what she felt through the numbness. Couldn't tell friction from the absence of it until she shifted weight and found out the hard way whether she'd been right. She broke through ice twice in the first 10 feet, both times catching herself on the hold below. Her knee, when she had to push off it, sent white light up into her vision. She kept climbing. Rowan was above her by a body length, moving faster than she was and pausing at each ledge to check her progress with a look that wasn't condescending. It was the look of someone managing a shared problem and keeping count of all the variables. When she reached the first narrow ledge, maybe 20 feet up, he gave her his hand without being asked, and she took it without making anything of it. Practical. The same way you hand someone a tool they need. They were 30 feet up when the first shot came from below. Not from the pass, from behind them. The riders from the ridge had arrived early, or the signal shot had told them where to go. Either way, a rifle cracked, and the round hit rock 6 feet below Evelyn with a spark and a sound like a hammer. "Move," Rowan said, and she moved. The last 20 feet were worse than the first 30 because they were moving fast now, abandoning caution for speed, and her hands were bleeding from where she'd broken through ice and the rock had taken skin. She didn't notice it in real time. She'd notice it later. Right now she climbed. She came over the top edge of the north wall with Rowan's hands on her forearms, hauling her the last 2 feet, and they both rolled behind the granite lip as another rifle shot cracked from below and sent snow off the ridge above their heads. She lay on her back for 3 seconds, looking up at the sky. That same enormous clear sky. Stars gone now, full daylight. A hawk circling far up in the blue with the profound indifference of things that live above the tree line. Then she sat up and looked at the pass below them. From above, she could see Kate's men clearly for the first time. 5 of them, positioned in the rocks at the east exit of the pass, sight lines trained on the entrance where anyone coming through the cut on horseback would be completely exposed for 60 yards. A killing ground. If they'd ridden straight in, they would have been dead in the first 10 seconds. Rowan was already flat on the ridge beside her, rifle out, looking at the same configuration. "The one on the left has the best angle on the cut," he said quietly. "If he moves first, the others follow." "How many can you hold down from here?" "All 5 if they stay in position. If they move up the east wall to get a counter angle on us." He indicated the rock face on the opposite side of the pass. "Then it gets complicated." She looked at the east wall, looked at the angles, looked at the men below, and the configuration of the rocks and the space between them. Her father had raised her on geometry and maps. She'd been looking at terrain and calculating distances since she was 12 years old. "If 2 of them move to the east wall," she said, "they have to cross open ground for about 15 feet. Here," she pointed. "No cover." "That's right." "So when they move, that's our moment." He looked at her sideways. Not the calibrating look. Something new, something that had been building for 5 days, and was now simply present in his face without being explained or managed. "You're not bad at this," he said. "I'm a bookkeeper," she said. "Bookkeepers are good at finding where the numbers are exposed." She pulled the revolver, the one he'd given her, heavier than her own, its weight now familiar in her hand after 2 days, and checked the cylinder for the 3rd time since morning. Fully loaded. She hadn't fired it yet. She'd been careful not to fire it yet. Below them, Del Kate moved out from behind a boulder. She got her first clear look at him. He was not what she'd expected, which was a foolish thing to have. Expectations about a man like this. He was average height, unremarkably built, wearing a good coat that said money without shouting it. His face was ordinary, not cruel-looking, not scarred, the face of an accountant or a land assessor. A face that would have been at home behind a desk in Denver, which was probably the point. Monsters that looked like monsters were easy to avoid. He walked to the center of the pass exit and looked up. "Black Ridge," he called. His voice carried well in the cut, calm, almost conversational. "I know you're up there. I know the woman is with you. I want the ledger pages and I want her, and then everybody goes home." Rowan said nothing. "I have men coming down the ridge," Kate continued, "and I have men here. You have a rock and about 20 minutes of daylight advantage before my people get to the east wall." He paused. "This is not a negotiation. I'm offering you a chance to make a decision before the decision gets made for you." Silence. The hawk was still circling, very far up. Rowan looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. She thought about a fire 7 years ago, about ink-stained hands folded across a chest, about 14 pages of careful handwriting that had cost more than any ledger had a right to cost. She pulled the saddlebag across her lap, felt the shape of the oilcloth packet through the leather. Still there. "Del Kate," she said, loud enough to carry. Her voice was steady. She was surprised by how steady it was. A pause from below. "Miss Mercer, my father kept records for 12 years, she said. Do you understand what that means? 12 years. He was meticulous. He documented everything." She paused. "You're not looking for 14 pages. You're looking for 140, because what I have is the summary. The full record is already somewhere. You'll never find it." It was not entirely a lie. It was not entirely the truth. The full record, so far as she knew, had been in her father's office, which Granger's men had certainly already taken apart. But Kate didn't know what she knew. A long silence from below. Then, to the man on his left, Kate said something she couldn't hear. 2 men moved for the east wall. "Now," Evelyn said. Rowan fired. The next 40 seconds were loud and disorienting and nothing like the clean, purposeful violence of the stories she'd grown up hearing. It was smoke and concussion and the physical shock of the revolver bucking in her hands as she fired twice at the moving figures crossing the open ground. She didn't know if she hit anyone. She didn't have time to know. And Rowan working the rifle with a speed and precision that was, she thought, somewhere behind the deafening present, genuinely remarkable. When it stopped, there was one man down in the open ground, one retreating behind the boulders with his arm wrong, and Kate himself was gone, back into the rocks, out of sight. The men from the ridge had not yet arrived. The hawk was still circling. Rowan reloaded with hands that were entirely steady and said, in a voice that was barely above normal conversation, "They'll reassemble. We have maybe 5 minutes." She was reloading her own cylinder. Her hands were shaking slightly, and she noticed it the way you notice weather, acknowledging it, filing it, not letting it mean anything in this particular moment. "The horses," she said. "The horses," he agreed, and they moved, descending 30 feet of ice granite in 5 minutes, with men reassembling in the rocks below them, was an experience that compressed time and sensation into something so immediate there was no room for anything else. She lost skin off both palms. Her knee gave out once on the last 10 feet, and she came down harder than she'd intended, caught herself with both hands, kept moving. August was where she'd left her. Rowan's gray was 3 feet away, patient and solid. They mounted and he looked at her bloody palms, at the way she was holding herself on the horse, and something in his expression did a thing that she didn't have the presence of mind to interpret right now. "There's a third route," he said. "I didn't want to use it. It goes through exposed terrain for 2 miles with no cover." "Does it get us to Boulder? If we don't stop?" "Then we don't stop," she said. "Show me." He turned the gray. She turned August. Behind them, from the direction of the pass, Kate's voice carried one more time. No words, just an order, sharp and flat. The sound of men being directed. Rowan touched his heels to the gray's sides and moved northeast at a run. Evelyn was beside him before he'd covered 20 yards. The mountains opened up ahead of them, enormous and cold and different, the way mountains always are. The sky above was that specific Colorado blue that had no equivalent anywhere else, hard and clean and very high, and the snow stretched out in every direction with a completeness that made the whole world look like it had been started over. She kept her eyes forward, her father's watch pressed against her hip, hands still frozen at 11:47, and for the first time since she'd found him, she didn't think about where the hands had stopped. She thought about where they were going. She thought, "We are going to make it." She did not say it out loud. Some things you don't say until you know they're true, and they weren't there yet. But she thought it, and she kept riding. The 2 miles of exposed terrain were exactly as bad as Rowan had described, and then somewhat worse. The route he'd chosen cut across the face of the eastern slope, where the tree line dropped away and left nothing between them and the sky. No cover, no shelter, just open snowfield that ran a 1/4 mile wide in some sections with the mountain falling away sharply to the south and the wind coming across it unimpeded from the northwest. Every instinct said don't cross open ground when men with rifles are behind you. The math said there was no other option, so they crossed it anyway, and the instincts would have to manage their objections later. Evelyn kept August at a full run for the first half-mile and then pulled her back to a hard canter when she felt the mare starting to labor. The altitude and the days of inadequate rest were showing now, the easy speed of the first hour becoming something that required more from the horse than August had left to give without careful management. She hated slowing down. She did it anyway because a horse that went down out here was worse than slower. Rowan matched her pace without being asked. They didn't talk. There was nothing to say that would improve the situation, and the wind took words away before they traveled anyway. So they rode in the close functional silence they'd developed over 5 days and watched the terrain ahead and didn't look back at the past they'd left behind them. Because looking back was a thing you could do when you could afford the information it gave you. Right now they couldn't afford it. The exposed section ended where a long finger of spruce forest came down off the upper ridge and met the slope, and they came into the trees at a pace that was still faster than comfortable, and only began to slow when the timber thickened enough around them to mean that anyone watching from the pass with a long rifle had lost the angle. Rowan pulled the gray up, and she stopped August beside him, and they both sat there for a moment listening to the sound of their own breathing, and the horses' breathing, and the trees, and nothing else. No pursuit. Not yet. "How far back are they?" she asked. "Kate's a methodical man. He won't rush into the trees without knowing where we came out." He scanned the forest ahead with the automatic, constant attention of someone who had been living in threat for long enough that it had become simply the way he used his eyes. He'll send men around, try to cut us off closer to town. How many ways into Boulder from this direction? 3 main routes. He knows them all. He looked at her. At her hands, which she'd wrapped in strips torn from the spare shirt in her saddlebag. Not a good field dressing, but better than riding with bleeding palms for another several hours. We're not going to make it into Boulder on the main road. Then we don't use the main road. There's a freight track, runs east of the main route, comes into the south end of town near the feed yards. It's used by the supply wagons in summer. In March, it won't have been traveled in weeks. He paused. It adds time we may not have. She thought about Kate, about the way he'd stood in the center of that pass exit and called up to them with the calm of a man who had done this before and understood that patience, properly applied, was more reliable than force. He would be thinking about routes right now. He would be thinking about where 2 people running for Boulder would have to emerge. He'll be watching the freight track too, she said. Probably. Then we need to get to Harding before Kate gets to us. She turned August to face east, deeper into the trees. Is there anyone in Boulder who Kate doesn't own? Someone who could get a message to Harding faster than we can ride there? He thought about it. The silence was long enough that she'd started to think he was going to say no. There's a woman named Ruth Calloway, he said finally. She runs the laundry on 2nd Street. Her husband was one of the men Granger's people put in the South Platte 2 years ago. He said it plainly, without embellishment, the way you state a fact that has already been grieved and cataloged. She's been waiting for someone to come through with something that would matter. I've sent her letters. She knows who I am. Evelyn looked at him. You've been building toward this for a long time. Yes, all of it. The contacts, the routes, knowing Calloway's name, knowing Harding. She kept her voice neutral. You've been planning this since before my father copied those pages. I've been planning this since I buried my family, he said, and the flatness of it was not coldness, she understood now. It was the sound of something that had been said so many times inside a person's own head that the emotion had been worn smooth, like a stone in a riverbed. Still heavy, just no longer rough. She nodded once and didn't push further. Some things didn't need to be interrogated, they just needed to be acknowledged. They rode east through the timber for another hour before the trees thinned again, and the terrain began its long descent toward the lower valleys, where the snow was patchy and the frozen mud of early spring showed through in the low spots. The mountains were still enormous behind them, but they were behind them now rather than around them, and the sky ahead had the different quality of sky over populated land, not cleaner or bluer, just somehow more inhabited. Boulder was maybe 6 miles out when Rowan pulled up. She stopped beside him and looked at what he was looking at. A farm track running south. 2 riders at the far end of it, maybe half a mile away, sitting still in the way of people who are waiting and have been waiting long enough to be comfortable with it. Kate's people, she said. Not a question. Probably. He studied them. They're not moving toward us, just watching the approach. How many ways around them? None that don't add 2 hours. He looked at the sky. The light was going amber, afternoon sliding toward evening. We don't have 2 hours. She studied the 2 riders, their horses, the farm track running between 2 fields that were still snow-covered, flat and open, with no cover for 300 yards in either direction. Beyond them, where the track met the main road, there was a stand of bare cottonwoods and then the first outlying buildings of town. If we ride straight at them, she said, we reach them before they can effectively communicate with anyone behind us, 2 against 2. They'll have rifles out at that range. So will we. She checked the revolver. Reloaded that morning, still fully loaded. She hadn't fired it since the pass. I'm not suggesting we're faster. I'm suggesting we're more committed. He looked at her with that expression that had been developing over 5 days, the one she'd started to be able to read. It wasn't surprise anymore. It was something that had moved past surprise into a more settled territory. Your father teach you this part too? He asked. My father taught me that the numbers always tell you something, she said. Right now the numbers say we don't have the time to go around, so we go through. A pause. Then he unslung his rifle and laid it across his saddle. Stay left of me. If they split, you take the one on the right because he's sitting the worse horse, and he'll be slower to react when they see us coming. How do you know that from half a mile? The horse is standing wrong, hip dropped, too much weight on the front. He looked at her. You ready? She settled into the saddle, adjusted her grip on the reins, and looked at the two waiting riders with a clarity that she recognized as the particular absence of fear that arrives when you've been afraid for so long that it has simply exhausted itself and left behind something cleaner and more useful. Yes, she said. They went. The half-mile closed fast. She kept August at a hard gallop, straight line, left side of the track like Rowan had said, and she watched the two men ahead of them go from still to suddenly, urgently in motion, shouting to each other, reaching for weapons, horses moving under them in the panicked way of animals picking up their rider's alarm. The man on the right, on the poorly standing horse, had exactly the problem Rowan had predicted. The horse shied left when he tried to bring it around, and he spent 3 seconds fighting it that he didn't have. The man on the left got his rifle up. A rifle shot went somewhere above Evelyn's head. She heard it more than felt it, the specific quality of near miss that she hoped she would never become familiar enough with to stop noticing. Rowan returned fire from horseback, which was a difficult thing and mostly a statement of aggression rather than accuracy. But the statement landed. The left-hand rider pulled his horse back and sideways, losing his position. They went through. Not clean. Nothing was clean. August's shoulder clipped the left-hand horse as they passed and nearly unseated Evelyn, who grabbed leather and stayed on through the kind of desperate grip that works once and won't work twice. Behind her she heard shouting and the sound of a horse going to its knees, the poorly standing one, she thought. But she didn't look back. She looked forward. The cottonwoods. The buildings. The road surface changing under August's hooves from farm track mud to something more traveled. People ahead, ordinary Boulder people going about the particular business of a late afternoon in early spring, who were now stopping and staring at two people on horseback coming into the south end of town at a speed that said something was wrong. Rowan pulled up beside a feed store whose sign she didn't have time to read. He was breathing hard. The gray was blowing. Calloway's laundry is 3 blocks north, he said. We leave the horses here. We can't leave the horses. Kate's men will. If we ride to the laundry, we announce to everyone in town where we're going. He was already dismounting, looping the gray's reins around the hitching post. Kate has eyes in Boulder. We walk 3 blocks and we look like we belong here. She dismounted. The knee caught her on landing and she went down to one knee in the mud of the road before she caught herself on the post and straightened. Rowan saw it. He moved to stand beside her in a way that would block the view of it from anyone watching from down the street, not making a thing of it, just placing himself. She didn't say thank you. He didn't expect her to. They walked north. 3 blocks was not a long distance. It was long enough, on a bad knee, in a town where any face might be reporting to Del Kate, with a saddlebag over one shoulder that contained everything they'd been running toward for 5 days. She kept her pace even and her eyes forward and noticed, with a part of her mind that was still running the same inventory it had been running since Cartwell, that her hands had stopped shaking. Somewhere between the pass and this mud street, they'd stopped shaking. She filed that away for later. Ruth Calloway's laundry was a narrow building wedged between a hardware concern and a boarding house, with steam coming from a vent pipe above the door and a hand-lettered sign that was entirely businesslike. Rowan opened the door without knocking, and she followed him inside. The woman at the large washtub in the back straightened when she saw Rowan. She was maybe 50, with strong forearms and gray-streaked hair pinned back practically, and her face when she recognized him went through several things in quick succession. Relief and something older and heavier than relief, the expression of someone who has been waiting for news that might be good or might be the final confirmation of the worst. "You're alive," she said. Her voice was steady. "For now," he said. "I need to get a message to Harding. Fast. Tonight if possible." She looked at Evelyn, a long, direct look that assessed without being unkind. "This is the Mercer woman." "Yes." "You have the papers?" "We have them," Evelyn said. Ruth Calloway dried her hands on her apron, crossed the room, and locked the front door. Then she turned back to them with the focused efficiency of someone who has been waiting to be useful and knows exactly what that looks like. "My nephew rides for the Federal Postal Service," she said. "He can have a rider to Harding's office in 2 hours. She looked at Rowan. "What do you need him to carry?" Rowan reached inside his coat and produced the document she'd seen him transfer to his inner pocket on the mountain. She still didn't know what it contained, and now was apparently the time she found out. He unfolded it on the clean section of Ruth Calloway's work table. A letter, 2 pages, dense with writing in Rowan's compact hand. "Everything I have," he said. 2 years of documentation, cross-referenced with what's in the ledger pages. He looked at Evelyn. She understood. She reached into her boot and pulled out the oilcloth packet. Her father's 14 pages, still dry, still intact, the ink unsmeared despite everything. The cold and the falls and the rock climb and the desperate gallop through someone's farm fields. She unfolded them onto the table beside Rowan's letter. Ruth Calloway looked at the pages for a moment. She looked at the name circled twice at the bottom of the last one. "James would have wanted to see this," she said quietly. James was, Evelyn understood, Ruth Calloway's husband, in the South Platte 2 years ago. "I know," Rowan said. Ruth straightened and went to the back of the building without further ceremony, and they heard her voice through the wall, low and urgent, and then a younger voice answering, and then the sound of someone moving fast. Evelyn stood at the work table and looked at her father's handwriting spread out under the lamp. 12 separate incidents documented in that careful accountant's hand, names and dates and dollar amounts in their precise columns. The language of someone who understood that the only testimony that lasts is the kind that doesn't require trust to verify. She put her hand flat on the pages for a moment. Just for a moment. Rowan was watching her. When she looked up, he didn't look away, which was one of his qualities that she'd noticed. He didn't perform disinterest. If he was watching you, he let you see it. "He did everything right," she said. "My father. He did everything exactly right, and it's still—" She stopped. "I know," Rowan said. "That's not a comfort." "No," he agreed. "It isn't." He paused. "But it means what we're carrying is solid. It means when Harding puts this in front of a federal judge, there's no argument against it that doesn't require calling your father a liar. And your father was not a liar." She looked at him. This large, careful, complicated man who had arrived at the same grief from a completely different direction and had been carrying his version of it for 7 years without letting it make him small. "What do you do," she said, "when it's over? When Granger's in front of a judge and Kate is wherever Kate ends up, what do you do after that?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not know the answer. "I haven't let myself think about it much," he said finally. "It felt like counting on something." He looked at the pages on the table. "Survey work, maybe. There's a lot of territory west of here that nobody's properly mapped." He glanced at her with something that was not quite the almost smile, but was its close relative. "I'm good at it when I'm not using the maps for anything corrupt." "You'd go back into the mountains." "I'd go back into the mountains," he confirmed. "What about you?" She thought about it honestly, which was something she hadn't done yet, allowed herself to think past the immediate problem to the shape of what came after. Her father's house in Cartwell, which she didn't want to go back to. The bookkeeping work, which she was good at and which felt entirely different now than it had a week ago, like a tool she'd been using one way all her life and had just discovered a second purpose for. "I don't know yet," she said. "I'll figure it out when I'm not being shot at." The almost smile arrived, complete this time, and it changed his face in the way she'd noticed once before. Younger, less fortified, like the person he'd been before the fire was still in there somewhere, and occasionally came briefly to the surface. Ruth Calloway came back through the door. "My nephew has the letter. He'll ride to the federal office directly." She looked at both of them. "You can't stay here. If Kate's people are in town, they'll work their way to my door eventually. They know my name." She didn't say how she knew this, and neither of them asked. "There's a hotel on 4th Street. The man who owns it is not in anyone's pocket because he's too stubborn to be and too old to be afraid. Tell him Ruth sent you. He'll put you in rooms and he won't say you're there." Rowan looked at Evelyn. She was exhausted. Not the theatrical exhaustion of someone who wants acknowledgement, the deep structural kind that lives in the bones and behind the eyes and has been accumulating since she found her father on his sitting room floor 5 days ago. She probably looked it. She didn't care. "All right," she said. At the door, Ruth Calloway put her hand briefly on Evelyn's arm. The touch was light and not prolonged, the gesture of someone who understood the limits of what comfort can do but offered it anyway. "Your father's name was Thomas Mercer," the older woman said. "I want you to know that I've heard it before tonight. There were people who knew what he was doing and who were grateful for it, even when he didn't know they knew. She released Evelyn's arm. He wasn't alone. I want you to know that. Evelyn stood in the door of the laundry with the cold evening air coming in behind her, and the lamplight from inside falling across the table where her father's pages still lay. And for a moment, the exhaustion and the relief and the 5 days of compressed grief all arrived simultaneously in a way that had no useful outlet. She pressed her teeth together and breathed through it. "Thank you," she said. Her voice was even. She made sure of it. They walked to the hotel on 4th Street in the early dark, and Boulder moved around them with the ordinary business of a small city at the end of a workday. Men coming out of the saloon, a wagon coming down the main street, a woman hanging laundry from a second-floor window with the particular determined efficiency of someone who intends to get it done before the temperature dropped further. Nobody paid them any particular attention, which meant either Kate's people hadn't reached this part of town yet, or the town had seen enough of Granger's business pass through it to have learned that not noticing was the safer instinct. The hotel owner was exactly as described, old and stubborn and not frightened of much, with the look of a man who had lived in this territory long enough to have a considered opinion about who deserved his cooperation and who didn't. He looked at them both with sharp eyes, heard Ruth Calloway's name, and led them upstairs without a word. 2 rooms, adjacent, which she didn't comment on, and he didn't explain. She sat on the edge of the bed in hers and unwrapped her hands and looked at the damage. Not as bad as she'd feared, the skin abraded and sore, but nothing that wouldn't heal clean. She cleaned them as well as she could with the water in the basin. She took off her boots. She found the oilcloth packet was no longer in her boot because it was on the table in Ruth Calloway's laundry on its way to a federal marshal, and the absence of it against her shin, that familiar pressure she'd been carrying for 5 days, felt strange in a way she hadn't expected, like something had been set down that she'd forgotten she was holding. She lay back on the bed without taking off her coat because the room was cold and the fire in the small stove hadn't caught yet, and stared at the ceiling, and was still awake an hour later when she heard Rowan's chair scrape on the other side of the wall and then go quiet again. Both of them awake. Both of them watching the dark. Different rooms, same vigil. She closed her eyes. She thought about the hawk, still circling somewhere above the pass they'd come through, indifferent to all of it. The men in the rocks, the rifle shots, the 2 people climbing 30 feet of iced granite with everything they had. The hawk had its own concerns. She thought, we made it here, not all the way. Not finished. But here, which was further than the blizzard had wanted, further than the bounty men in the tree line had planned for, further than Del Cate had accounted for when he'd positioned his men at the pass exit and waited for 2 people to be sensible and surrender. They hadn't been sensible. She thought that was probably something her father would have appreciated. She slept. She woke before dawn to the sound of horses in the street below. Not the ordinary sound of early morning traffic. There was a purposefulness to it, multiple animals moving together in the particular cadence of organized men rather than individual travelers. She was at the window before she was fully awake, looking down through the wavy glass at the main street of Boulder where the first pale light was barely starting to separate the buildings from the sky. 4 riders, federal badges catching what little light there was. And walking beside the lead horse, unhurried, in the long coat and practical boots of a man who had ridden through the night and didn't feel the need to perform anything about it, a broad-shouldered figure she didn't recognize until he turned his face toward the hotel and she saw it clearly for the first time. Marshal Warren Harding was older than she'd expected. 60, maybe, with a white mustache and the kind of face that had been weathered past the point where further weather could do much to it. He moved like someone who had been doing this for 30 years and had stopped being impressed by urgency because urgency was simply the weather his work occurred in. A knock at her door. She opened it. Rowan, already dressed, already holding his rifle. "Harding's here," he said. "I know, I saw him." Something passed between them. The same wordless exchange they'd been having for days. The shorthand of 2 people who have shared enough compressed time that whole sentences became unnecessary. She grabbed her coat and they went downstairs together. The meeting happened in the hotel's small dining room, which the owner cleared without being asked, and then stood outside the door with his arms crossed, and an expression that said he'd been waiting 20 years for something like this to happen in his establishment and was not about to let anyone interrupt it. Harding sat across the table from them both and read through Rowan's letter first, slowly, going back twice to certain sections. Then he read through her father's pages, all 14 of them in the same methodical way, one finger occasionally tracing a column of figures. When he finished, he put everything down flat on the table and looked at them both with eyes that were sharp, in a way that the rest of his worn face almost concealed. "Thomas Mercer," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. "I heard about what happened in Cartwell. I'm sorry." "I'd rather you be useful than sorry," Evelyn said. A pause. Harding looked at her. Then something shifted at the corners of his eyes. Not quite a smile, but the recognition that passes between people who have just established they're going to get along. "Fair enough," he said. He looked back at the pages. "This is real." "It's real," Rowan said. "Your father's hand?" Harding asked Evelyn. "I watched him write in that hand my entire life." She met the marshal's eyes steadily. "I can testify to that in any court you put me in front of." Harding nodded slowly. He tapped the pages with one finger, not the gesture of someone uncertain, the gesture of someone confirming a decision already made. Combined with what Blackridge has built over 2 years and the testimony of 2 living witnesses, he stopped, looked at Rowan. "Delcate is in this territory." "He was at the Eastern Pass yesterday morning," Rowan said. "Then he knows you're here. He knows we're in Boulder. He doesn't know where. He'll know soon enough." Harding looked at one of his deputies in the doorway, a young man with a serious face who had apparently been listening with the focused attention of someone filing everything away. "Reeves, send the wire to the federal district office. Use the language we discussed." The deputy left immediately. Harding turned back to them. "I've been building toward a federal warrant for Granger for 2 years. What you've brought me fills the last gap." He said it plainly, without drama. "I can have the warrant executed within 48 hours. Evelyn thought about Silas Granger sitting in his Denver office beneath the photograph of himself and the senator, organizing the machinery of other people's ruin with the calm confidence of a man who had never once been made to account for any of it. 48 hours is a long time for a man with Granger's resources," she said. "It is," Harding agreed. "Which is why you're both going to stay in this building under federal protection until the warrant is served." He looked at Rowan. "Can you accept that?" Rowan's jaw moved slightly. She knew, without him saying it, what the acceptance cost. 2 years of operating alone, making all his own decisions, trusting no structure because every structure had failed him. Being told to sit and wait while someone else executed the plan he'd been building with his own hands since he had nothing left but the plan. He looked at Evelyn. She looked back at him. "Yes," he said. The 48 hours were, in their way, harder than the mountains. Waiting always was. The mountains had required constant action, something to solve, somewhere to move, a problem with physical dimensions that responded to physical effort. The hotel room required only stillness and patience, and stillness was the one thing neither of them had been able to afford for days. Now it was all they had, and it sat on them both differently. Rowan spent most of the first day at the window, watching the street below with the rifle across his knees, which the hotel owner had apparently decided was acceptable given the circumstances. Evelyn found the hotel owner's small shelf of books and read without retaining much of it, which was fine because the purpose wasn't information. It was giving her eyes somewhere to be that wasn't the walls. Harding's deputies were outside. 2 of them, visible from the window, and presumably more positioned elsewhere that Harding hadn't specified and she hadn't asked about. She trusted Harding's competence the way Rowan had described trusting the ice, based on evidence, with the understanding that certainty wasn't available. On the afternoon of the first day, one of Harding's men brought word that Delcate had been located at a hotel 3 streets over. He hadn't run. That fact had its own shape to it. A man like Kate not running meant he either had something planned or he'd made a calculation that flight made him look worse than staying. "He's going to try to buy his way out," Rowan said, when she relayed this. "Can he?" "At the territory level, yes. Federal level?" He looked at the window. "It depends on how clean Harding's chain is above him." She thought about this. She thought about all the ways this could still go wrong. A judge with the wrong connections, a warrant that got delayed, a file that disappeared from a federal building the way Rowan's documentation had disappeared 2 years ago. She thought about her father, who had done everything right and died anyway. The machinery of corruption was not a simple thing to dismantle. You could have the right evidence and the right marshal and still end up watching it slide sideways at the last moment because the man who needed to sign the warrant owed someone a favor, and favors were the actual currency of the territory. She knew all this. She thought about it honestly and without comfort, because comfortable thinking was the kind that left you unprepared. Then she folded it away and went back to the book she wasn't retaining and let Rowan watch the window. Harding came himself on the morning of the second day. He sat down across from them both with the look of a man who had not slept but wasn't going to mention it, and placed a document on the table between them. She looked at it. A federal warrant signed and sealed with Silas Granger's name on it in the formal language of law that turned a man from a powerful abstraction into a specific defendant. Below it, a second warrant. Del Kate. The district judge signed both at midnight, Harding said. Granger's people tried to reach him before the signing. They were delayed. He said the word with a dryness that suggested the delay had been arranged, and that he was not going to say more about how. I have federal deputies in Denver executing the primary warrant within the hour. Granger will be in custody before noon. Evelyn looked at the warrant, at the name, at the formal, impersonal language of justice, which was not satisfying in the way she'd imagined it would be, and was also, she acknowledged, the only version of satisfaction that was actually available. Silas Granger, arrested and charged and tried, was not the same as her father alive. She had known this. She still had to sit with the actual weight of it when it arrived. "And Kate?" Rowan asked. His voice was very controlled. "My men are picking him up this morning." Harding looked at Rowan directly. "I know what you want. I'm asking you to let the law do what you've spent 2 years helping it be able to do." A long silence. The kind that has real content, not awkward, not empty, but full of a man making a decision that costs him something genuine. "He'll be tried?" Rowan said. "He'll be tried." Harding held his gaze. "Federal court. The evidence you've built, the testimony from this table, will put him there for what's left of his life. That's not nothing, Blackridge. That's not nothing." Rowan looked at the warrant. She watched him look at it, watched something in him process the gap between what he'd imagined justice would feel like for 7 years and what it actually felt like when it arrived in the form of a piece of signed paper on a hotel table. It wasn't the gap between expectation and disappointment. It was something more complicated. The gap between vengeance, which was personal and immediate and would have left him with nothing afterward, and justice, which was slow and imperfect and institutional and would leave Kate somewhere confined and accountable for the rest of his days. Not the same thing. Never the same thing. "All right," Rowan said. Harding nodded. He gathered the warrants and stood. At the door he paused and looked at Evelyn. "Your testimony will be required for the trial. Both of yours. That's months away, likely. I'll need to know where to reach you." She looked at Rowan. He looked back at her. "We'll let you know," she said. Harding left. She sat at the table and Rowan sat across from it, and the room was very quiet. Outside, Boulder was going about its morning. She could hear the ordinary sounds of it, a cart horse, someone calling to someone across the street, the particular rhythm of a place that didn't know yet that something had shifted in its territory. It would know by afternoon, she thought. Word traveled fast. "It's done," she said, testing the words. "The beginning of it," he said. "The trial will be—" "I know." She did know. Trials were long and legal and full of the grinding machinery of institutions that moved at their own pace, regardless of what anyone wanted. Granger would have lawyers. Kate would have lawyers. There would be delays and motions, and the specific indignities of watching men try to dismantle your father's careful testimony in open court. She was prepared for all of it. Prepared wasn't the same as ready, but it was what she had. "He won't walk," Rowan said, with a certainty that she understood was not false comfort, but genuine assessment. "Not with what we gave Harding, the ledger pages alone, in your father's hand with your testimony. That's a case that doesn't fall apart under cross-examination." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." A pause. Outside, the sounds of Boulder continued undisturbed. "What happens to the land?" she asked. "The ranches Granger took, the people he displaced." "Federal process," Rowan said. "It'll take time. Most of the deeds can be contested and reversed if there are living claimants." He paused. "Some of those people have been gone 5, 6 years. Some of them gave up and moved on and won't know to come back." That was the part that wouldn't be clean. She'd known it wouldn't be clean. Nothing about this had been clean. Not her father's careful records, or the blizzard that had nearly killed her, or the climb up 30 feet of iced rock, or any of it. The law would do what the law could do, and it wouldn't reach everyone who'd been hurt. And that was the true cost of what Granger had spent 20 years building. Not just the immediate damage, but the compounding damage. The lives permanently redirected by theft and fraud, and the occasional quiet murder in a hotel stairwell. She thought about that for a long time, sitting in the hotel dining room with the winter light coming through the window, and she let herself feel the full inadequacy of it. The fact that justice was real and also insufficient, that both of those things were true simultaneously and neither canceled the other out. Her father would have understood that arithmetic. 3 days later, they rode out of Boulder. Not together, not exactly. They were heading in the same direction, north out of town toward the open territory, and they rode side by side because the road was wide enough and there was no reason not to, but neither of them had said anything definitive about what that meant. The warrants had been executed. Granger had been taken into federal custody in Denver with, according to the telegram Harding sent to the hotel, considerably less drama than anyone had expected. The machinery of power that had protected him for 2 decades simply folded when federal authority arrived with proper documentation, because that was the other truth about men like Granger. Their power was real right up until the moment it wasn't, and then it was nothing at all. Kate had been arrested without incident at his hotel on the 3rd Street. He'd been sitting at a table eating breakfast, according to Harding's deputy, and he'd put his fork down and stood up and held his hands out with the expression of a man who had calculated the odds and found them unacceptable. A methodical man to the end. She'd thought she would feel more when she heard that. She felt something, but it was quieter than she'd expected. Not the release she'd been imagining, but something more like the settling of a building after long structural stress. A very deep, very quiet sense of weight, redistributed. August was sound. The knee had healed as much as it was going to with 3 days of rest, which meant it was adequate rather than good, but adequate would do. The mare moved well in the morning cold, ears up, clearly relieved to be out of the livery stable and back in open air. Rowan rode beside her on the gray, and for a while they didn't say much because the morning was enough. The light coming across the open country east of the mountains, the snow still deep in the low spots but retreating from the south-facing slopes where the March sun was starting to find purchase. The sky was the color it got when the air was cold and completely clear, a blue so specific to this altitude and season that she'd never found a word for it that was quite right. Ruth Calloway's husband, she said, after a while. James? Granger's people? Yes. He didn't elaborate, and she didn't need him to. Will she know about the arrest? Harding will tell her. I think he'd consider that part of the job. He paused. She waited a long time. People do, Evelyn said, when they have to. They rode in comfortable silence for another mile. She thought about the things that had changed in the past week, and the things that hadn't. The watch in her pocket was still stopped at 11:47. She'd thought about getting it repaired and hadn't done it yet and wasn't sure she would. Not because she intended to grieve forever, but because 11:47 was also the time her father had left her something worth carrying, and she wasn't entirely ready to set that particular marker aside. She thought about what Ruth Calloway had said. He wasn't alone. She turned that over the way you turn over something you're not sure you believe yet, but want to. Her father had copied 14 pages in secret over 2 weeks with shaking hands because he was afraid and because he was Thomas Mercer. And Thomas Mercer did not look away from what the numbers told him, regardless of what it cost. And somewhere in the territory there had been people who knew, who had been watching with their own versions of hope, waiting for the evidence to find its way to someone who could use it. He hadn't known that. She was fairly certain he hadn't known that. He'd done it anyway. In the ordinary human darkness of not knowing whether what you're doing matters or whether anyone will ever understand what it cost. She thought that was probably the most important thing she'd learned in 7 days. Not the ridge route or how to climb iced granite or how to read a man's face when he's deciding whether to trust you. The most important thing was that her father had done the right thing without the reassurance that it would work in the specific and very human condition of not knowing. And it had worked. Not cleanly, not without loss, not in the way he'd intended, but it had worked. She could do the same. She didn't know yet what shape that would take. The trial was months away and she had to be findable for it, which meant somewhere in the territory with an address Harding could reach. She had skills: the accounting, the surveying knowledge her father had given her, the ability to look at a column of figures and find where the structure was weak. Those were real and portable, and the territory had no shortage of need for them, especially now that a substantial portion of Granger's fraudulent land arrangements were going to require untangling by someone who could read a deed and a survey record and tell you where the numbers had been made to lie. That was, she thought, work worth doing. She looked at Rowan. He was watching the horizon with the particular focused calm she'd learned over the past week was not distance, but attention. The look of someone whose entire way of existing in the world required him to see it clearly. "The territory west of here," she said. "The unmapped sections." He glanced at her. "What about them?" "Would a surveyor working out there need someone to manage the records, the accounts?" A pause. He understood what she was actually asking, and she understood that he understood, and neither of them performed otherwise, because that was also something they'd established over the past week. Neither of them had the patience for indirection when directness was available. "It would be useful," he said carefully. "I'd want to be paid," she said. "Fairly." "That's reasonable, and I'd want the arrangement to be clear from the beginning, what it is and what it isn't." She kept her eyes forward. "I don't do well with things that aren't named." "Neither do I." He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know how to do this well, being around someone." He said it with the same flatness he used for other difficult facts. Not self-pity, not asking for reassurance, just accurate reporting. "I've been alone up here long enough that I've probably developed habits that are difficult," she offered. "I was going to say well-established." "That's a generous reading of it." She glanced at him. "You also have 3 rules." "2, technically. The third one doesn't apply anymore." Something in his voice was different when he said it. Lighter, maybe, or less defended. "I know what you're carrying, and you know what I'm carrying. We're past the point where secrets are the main thing between us." She thought about this. About the specific and unlikely fact that the blizzard that had nearly killed her had also delivered her to the one person in the territory who was trying to accomplish the same thing she was, through the same means, with the same evidence, for reasons that rhymed with hers, in a way she hadn't known was possible until she found the papers in his chest and understood what they actually were. The world was not usually that organized. Usually grief isolated you because other people's losses were different shapes and the shapes didn't fit together. She wasn't sure yet what it meant that their shapes were similar enough to be workable. She knew it wasn't simple, and it wouldn't be simple, and they were both people with damage that didn't disappear just because the immediate crisis had resolved. But she also thought about how it had felt to ride out of that pass with him beside her, both of them running hard and neither of them running away from each other, and she thought that was worth something she didn't have a word for yet. "1 rule," she said. "If we do this." He waited. "Same one you had. Don't lie to me." She held his gaze for a moment. "Not about the hard things. Not to make things easier. If it's true, I can work with it." He looked at her for a long moment with those dark, direct eyes that she'd been reading for a week and was still not entirely finished learning. "1 rule," he said. "Same for both of us." She nodded and turned back to the road ahead. The mountains were behind them now, enormous and white and indifferent in the way that mountains always were. They did not care what had happened in their passes and on their ridge lines, did not register the 9 days ago version of Evelyn Mercer who had walked into a blizzard on a lame horse's worth of momentum and approximately no plan. The mountains would be here long after everyone involved in all of this was gone. That was not comforting or uncomforting. It was simply true, and she had learned over the past week to find something almost restful in the things that were simply true. The road north opened up ahead of them into the kind of country that hadn't been properly mapped yet. Wide and cold and full of the early spring light that changed everything it touched. And August moved under her with the easy, forward-reaching stride of a horse that had survived a very bad week and come out the other side still willing to go. Evelyn let her move. Her father had once told her, in the context of a column of figures that had been giving her trouble for an afternoon, that the numbers always made sense eventually. You just had to be patient enough to stay with them until they showed you what they were doing. She'd been impatient then, 17 years old and frustrated, and she'd pushed back on him. And he'd smiled at her over his reading glasses with the particular fondness of a parent watching a child argue against something they'll eventually understand. She understood it now. The past week had been an accounting of a very specific kind, a ledger of losses and decisions, and the compounding interest of other people's choices landing on ordinary lives. Her father's 14 pages were the most important set of records she'd ever seen, not because they contained numbers, but because they contained the thing that numbers at their best actually represented: the truth about where things had gone and what it had cost and who was responsible. She was her father's daughter. She knew how to read a ledger. She also knew how to close one when the books finally balanced. They rode north. The light was good. The road was long. And ahead of them, past the mapped territory and into the open country that still had no name on any survey, there was work to be done and enough road to do it on, and two people who had learned in the hardest possible week that the kind of trust worth having was the kind that had been tested and held. That was not a small thing. It was, in fact, everything.